As we get started here tonight, I'm going to do something that I really haven't done in a so-called formal talk. What I'm going to do is at times I'm going to open it up for a little bit of discussion. We have some letters that we're going to read together, and we're going to have, as I do in my class, rules of engagement, so to speak, and that is this. We keep our focus on the letters. We don't just divert and tell other stories that you might think that relate to that letter, and we try to listen to each other and speak to what somebody else is saying. And of course, above all else, everyone can have opinions about this, because we all know that in today's world, especially in education, what? Nobody is wrong. Everybody has a right answer. And I truly mean that when it comes to reading and discussing these letters. You got to feel free to just get your opinion out there, and we can bounce it around. So we're going to do that a few times during this talk. Again, something a little unusual. I will be sure to repeat what people have said, obviously because you guys are not mic'd up. So here we go. Let me say, one last thing. Civil War Institute Summer Conference, second weekend in June. You should look us up. You'll see that we have a wide array of speakers. We have tours as well. And if you are a member of this organization, you get a 15% discount to go. So look us up, send me an email, or a member of my staff, and we'll be sure to help you out. Let's go to the first letter. If you can open up your packets, please. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background before we read this letter. And the the idea of reading this letter is to get some kind of sense or handle as to what's happened to the author. The author is a North Carolina soldier from the 3rd North Carolina. See, I pay equal attention to the people in the back row as well as in the front row. His name's John Futch. He's from the 3rd North Carolina, as I said. He's from New Hanover County. Does everyone have one? Everyone got a sheet here? Are all good? He's from New Hanover County, North Carolina, just north of Wilmington. My wife, Beth Carmichael, who works at the library, she's a trained archivist. She is relentless in hunting down dead people on the census. And she has spent the last few weeks trying to find Mr. John Futch here. I can say this about him. She has found out more than I knew. Probably owned land. Back in the late 18th century, his 4th grandfather had a few slaves. But by the time that John has his own, I think probably a small bit of land, he doesn't have any slaves. And more importantly, he's illiterate. And we discovered just this week that illiteracy, it wasn't obviously a disease, but it ran in the family. It went back a few generations as well. So the letter I'm about to read to you is really quite remarkable, because we have so few letters from those men who are illiterate or semi-literate. They're often, as you could probably guess, they are extraordinarily poor. So this letter is from John Futch. He's speaking, or he was speaking, to a fellow soldier, a comrade. It's after the Battle of Chancellorsville, and here we go. It's obviously to his wife. His wife's name is Martha. And one last thing. Note the date. We've got to cover the basics here. That's right after Chancellorsville again, right? May 9th, just after Chancellorsville. Dear wife, this leaves me well, and I hope it may find you the same. I have been through the battles, and God has brought me out safe. And I feel more than thankful to think that while others have been cut down, I was the one who came out safe, but I feel very much worried after taking such heavy marches and being so much fatigued. We had a hard battle on that Saturday, but nothing to compare with that of Sunday. That was the day we lost so many of our friends, and so many were wounded. I thought that every man would be killed, and there would not be enough to tell the tale of the rest. I threw away my knapsack on the battlefield and everything I had, and was glad to get off without anything. I thought I had seen you for the last time, but God brought me through safe, and I feel very thankful for His kindness towards me. I have not got a letter from you. Since you left. I hope I will receive one in a few days. I hope we will not have to fight another battle this year. And if we do, I hope I will not have the pleasure of being in it again. Then he lists some of the dead and some of the wounded. He mentions Charlie, that's his older brother. Again, he said they took a few things. I took several good drinks of real old coffee. I never saw the like of the dead, never in my life. I must close. You must write soon. I want to hear from you and know how you got along home. Give my best love to all the family and a good portion to yourself. I remain as ever your devoted husband, John Futch. When I got back to camp, all was gone. It's okay. Now, the other critical point to this, and then you're going to tell me what has happened to John and what is he contending with, right, from this letter. I should note that after the Battle of Chancellorsville, he admitted himself, I assume, to a hospital. He was not wounded during the battle. There is no blood, not even a slight wound. But he, again, for reasons he does not fully explain, he admitted himself to a hospital. He was there for a few days. In reading this letter, you can note that when he was finally released, again, did he leave on his own? Did his doctors, did they release him? I don't know. But I do know from that letter that when he arrived at the old camp, that everybody was gone. All right. So there we have it. Key part 2 is that John admitted himself or was allowed to go with permission without a wound. He had no wound to a field hospital. What's happened to John? What's he dealing with here? Yeah, go ahead, Cameron. Right.
Some kind of survivor's guilt or post-traumatic stress disorder.
So let's try the first one here. Thank you so much, Cameron. I want you all, again, listen closely to all this. The terms that we use, and of course it's understandable that we use that terminology or language that we're familiar with. So survivor's guilt, I'm going to have someone else jump in here. Where do we see survivor's guilt in this letter? Does anyone else see it? While others have been cut down, I was the one who came out safe. There's the third line. Yeah? Now again, I move around from other people here. Can't just rely on the students. Hello, Mr. Hartwig. How are you doing there? Yeah? So what else is going on here? How else does he explain his survival to getting to the other side? Okay, just... Yeah, good, excellent, right? So he believes that mysterious hand of God or providence that somehow shielded him, but even that left him somewhat perplexed. Why me? And that might get back to Cameron's point about a little bit of survivor's guilt working on there as well. What about his physical and mental health condition? Do we get any inkling as to what that might have been from this letter? His physical or mental health condition? Any inkling of that at all? Look at the students want to raise their hands. I'm so proud of you all, but we got to let the adults get in here. Learning at all ages, right? Be respectful to your elders. Come on, y'all. What's going on with this guy? Yes, please, ma'am. He says fatigue. What do you think he means by that? Yeah. Certainly physical exhaustion. Do you want to leave it there? How about y'all? Just physical exhaustion? I'm going to still shun my students. I'm so sorry for you all. I'll get you back in this game here. Come on. Yes, ma'am. Go right ahead. Good, absolutely. He's feeling very much alone. His brother Charlie, his older brother, is obviously not there as well. He is physically exhausted. Anything else you want to add to this description here? Got survivor's guilt going on, right? But he steadied himself with some knowledge that maybe God had protected him. And he's physically exhausted. And I'd say maybe what? His nerves are frayed a little bit? Yes, go right ahead, sir.
He said he threw away his knapsack and everything he had with it.
Yeah. Charlie did as well, and I think Scott and others who study this have found time and time again that sometimes those are the orders that they are given. Officers didn't want them to be encumbered by knapsacks. In this instance, it's hard to tell if he didn't do it just on his own, but he is without knapsack, he's without blankets. So yes, he doesn't have some of those basic so-called accoutrements of war. I want to just say, go right ahead. Last point here, please. Good, wonderful. Did you all hear that back there? Excellent. Nope, I saw someone shake hands. One more time. You know, if one, you'd stand up so they can all hear you. That's a great point. I'm glad you got it.
He said, I hope I will not have to fight another battle this year, and if I do, I hope I do not have the pleasure of doing it again.
Now, listen, y'all, how we describe or categorize that, we're going to use some, what I would consider to be some fairly vague terms. And that really is the language that we have available to us. Some of you might say, this is just a homesick Johnny Reb. Some of you might say, this is a war-weary Johnny Reb. Some of you might say, this is a Johnny Reb suffering from PTSD. And that is the point, which we'll circle back to at the very end. Diagnosing these men can only get you so far. Can only get you so far. But what we do see, even in a man who's illiterate, who's talking to another soldier, that he did what? He opened up his interior world, right, to this other man so his wife would know what was going on with him. It is truly astonishing and remarkable. You're going to hold on to the thoughts about Mr. John Futch, and we'll come back to him in just a little bit. Try to do this off the top of my head. So I've told my students before they go off and do their public history jobs in the summer, I said there's certain things you need to learn, and that is you got to give talks that are accessible. And I told them if I ever caught wind of any of them saying in a public talk, we're going to discuss historiography, I said that's like ether coming out of your mouth. And I'm going to hunt you down, right? Can't say that word, so I'm not going to say it. But we're going to talk a little bit about how historians have treated this topic of how soldiers contended with the horrors of battle. There are two camps. The very first camp, and I'm going to be efficient, and this is a great book, a book that's still in print, a book that's worth your time, Eric Dean Jr. Nobody move their hands. I'm going to say it one more time so you can write it down. Ready? Just move your hand even if you're not really writing anything. It makes me feel like you're connected, right? Eric Dean Jr., the title's, it's an unusual one. Shook Over Hell. Shook Over Hell. Shook Over Hell by Eric Dean Jr. is a comparative study between Civil War soldiers and Vietnam soldiers. I will not delve deep into his argument. I will conclude by saying this. It is a book in which he found that Civil War soldiers endured and suffered hardships in the field and, of course, confronted terrible things on the battlefield, and those things stayed with them. And the behavior that many of these men exhibited after the war, there was the kind of behavior that he said he found in Vietnam veterans. I have done a great, probably, deal of damage to his very complex argument. His argument's based upon a collection of sources from an Indiana asylum in which he found the records of men who were obviously committed there, and there's just awful stories. And you can see what I believe is a more satisfying definition of PTSD. Ready? And that is that you have memories of your soldiering experience that are intrusive memories that you cannot control, and that those intrusive memories actually shape and control your behavior. Now, I'll give you one quick example from Eric Dean Jr. Eric Dean Jr. read an account from a woman, it's just absolutely tragic, in which she wrote down that her father, who was a survivor of Andersonville, I'm sorry, I can't help myself. I've got two students here. You didn't go, though, did you, Maddie? Did you go? Yeah. Danielle, a student right up here from California, who was at Fredericksburg last summer, but on Thanksgiving break. Where'd you go, Danielle? Andersonville. She went to Andersonville for Thanksgiving, right? It's a powerful place. It's unlike any battlefield, right? You just sort of get a sense of hopelessness and despair. Well, this woman's father, he was consumed by it. If he met you for the first time, she said that that's all he would talk about immediately. And then if he got you back to the house, he would invite you to the backyard, and in the backyard he built a replica of Andersonville to scale, and he would give you a tour. So the book is chock full of stories like that. I want to give you one other example about why some people are uncomfortable with this modern terminology, PTSD, that was not available to Civil War Americans. So why should we use it? Well, one scholar, Diane Somerville, she says, look, just because Civil War Americans were unaware of some of these psychiatric conditions that were the consequence of war, that they did not have the language that we have. And again, I want to stress, The word trauma did not exist with Civil War Americans. But what Somerville says, that's pointless, right? Because the fact remains is that the behaviors that they exhibited and that they wrote about is clearly some of the psychosis and some of the other problems that we've seen today. Good? All right. Now, the second camp are historians who believe that there's just simply not enough evidence out there to believe that Civil War soldiers were victims of PTSD. It's just not in the writings. Moreover, they claim that Civil War soldiers, that they were wired differently than we are today, culturally differently. That they had different attitudes about death and dying. They had different attitudes about killing. And in fact, it is without a doubt that killing made the man among Civil War Americans. No doubt that they were aghast about what they saw and what they did on the battlefield. That's utterly undeniable. But they were able to cope and contend, and above all else, they were able to make meaning of, ready? Suffering. Physical suffering, emotional suffering. They lived to suffer. I'm not being facetious. Why did they live to suffer? Because it is through suffering where you can demonstrate whether you have character or not. They live to suffer. There you have it. We have our two camps, right? And from there, it is worth our time, and I need to be efficient here because we have some more things to talk about. Okay, I can do it. Medical knowledge at the time might help us speculate about why Futch was sent back to his regiment. I want you to just listen to me, okay? I'm going to get you into this next document in just a moment. I'm going to give you a quick anecdote. There's a Pennsylvania soldier. He was not identified in this medical journal. There are 3 doctors. There's no reason for me to go back to my notes and give you their full names, but 3 physicians, and they used this man as a case study. He had survived Fredericksburg. He came into their hospital in Philadelphia. He was suffering from what he claimed was paralysis of his face. Good? All right. They didn't believe him. They did a series of pretty violent tests on him. First, they had him close his eyes, and they took a pencil, and they poked his cheek. He didn't wince. He did nothing, right? They weren't convinced. Right? They weren't convinced. As he claimed, his face was numb. They got a needle, and they poked him with the needle a couple times. Again, no reaction on his part whatsoever. You'd have thought that would have been enough, but it was not. They then proceeded to get flour. They put flour on his cheeks, pulled out a battery, and they put the ends of those batteries, I don't know what you would call the end of that, but they placed it on his cheeks, right? And as they turned up the voltage, they watched this man. They said that he was gritting his teeth, that his hands were clenching the chair. They could see his feet even sort of almost like digging into the ground, and they kept turning up the volume on that voltage. It did not break, and they still were convinced that he was faking all of it. Although at the end of this experiment on his body, he said basically that he had had enough and that he was cured. But they weren't done with him. They then flipped him over, and they said that what he was expressing in terms of his symptoms, that it was a common problem that they had found, and they were making all of this up, and it was a common problem that they believed originated in the spine. Now, I'm not sure what implement they used next. I assume some kind of needle. But they proceeded then to basically poke his spine at various angles, and as you can only imagine, truly excruciating. Through all of that, and I should note that that last test of his bodily strength and resolve, he was broken, man, broken. And the very next day, they discharged him. They sent him back to his regiment. And on the note, what did they write? Malingerer. That's what they called this man. And yet, even on that note, they admitted that he exhibited some bizarre physiological contradictory behavior or traits, right? So they're acknowledging that something here was not right, but obviously that did not keep them from engaging in torture. I should note that Southern doctors also used some of these same, certainly not experiments, but coercive tactics. One Southern doctor said that he recommended cauterization for reluctant Confederates. I don't know what they were cauterizing, but the word itself says everything to you. It should. He also said that they bucked a man who had supposedly, you might know what bucking is, right? You know, tie a man's hands behind his back. You tie often a bayonet or a stick between his legs. You put him in a crouched position, which is extraordinarily uncomfortable. They did that because the man had lost his ability to speak. Another soldier who claimed that he was suffering from night blindness, the doctors thought it would be a good idea to reduce his food intake. And finally, another doctor decided it was a good idea to drop turpentine in the eyes of a man to determine whether he was truly suffering from epilepsy. It's pretty brutal stuff. Clearly, these techniques, the idea was not just to get the man back into the ranks, the idea was to actually rebuild the man, right? Because in rebuilding this man, it was transforming his inner sort of will from coward to brave soldier. And the enlisted men, they didn't take this line down. One black soldier, a USCT soldier, he wrote about the medical establishment in the Army. If a man says he is sick, it is the doctor's privilege to say yes or no. If you cannot work, then you are sent to the guardhouse, bucked and gagged, and stay so till they see fit to relieve you. This is a brilliant last line. Now, do you call this equality? If so, God help such equality. So, clearly, from these coercive practices, we see that the medical establishment on both sides, they were suffering from night blindness, right? They had no sense, as we do, of the basis of trauma. No sense whatsoever. They had no idea how extreme terror might result in a physiological problem. They used, really vague terms such as low spirits, irritability of the heart, fatigue, and the one that not just the medical establishment used, but soldiers used, broken down. Why the words broken down, class? Think about Civil War soldiers and the world that most of them came from. Why broken down? How would they use the words broken down before the war? Or what would they ascribe it to? Yeah, go ahead. A machine in a factory, if you're working in a factory, right? And if you're not in a factory, and that farm equipment would be a horse, right? It would be a mule, right? It would be an animal, right, that had been abused, who had been punished, who had given out, nothing left to give. So soldiers often use those words to ascribe to themselves when they had or suffered from complete physical and mental exhaustion. So today, though, we use the term PTSD, and as I already said before, it is a term that has become extraordinarily capacious or expansive. It almost encompasses absolutely everything. In fact, you should note that just a few years ago, there was a study done. There are more women and men in the American military suffering from PTSD than ever before. What's fascinating about that fact is that we had fewer soldiers seeing actual combat. Right there, that tells you again how medical understandings obviously change, how definitions change over time. But what it doesn't say to us, and what I'm certainly not suggesting, is that somehow, some way, that American women and men in the military just aren't as brave, just aren't as sturdy as they were back in the Civil War era. That's obviously not the suggestion that I am making. What we need to do is to get an understanding of the key differences in what it meant to be a brave soldier. And if we understand that, we can get some attitudes about how they saw violence and what it did to the body. And in 1861, both sides rushed off with the belief that war made the man. Both sides believed that, in fact, in battle, in combat, you could prove your character. Both sides believed that in camp, if you lived morally, read your Bible, and stayed away from the bottle, right, you could have actual uplift and improvement. Both sides also believed, as I said to you before, about suffering. That a brave soldier, a noble soldier, that when he encountered distress, physical or emotional distress, that he suffered silently. And in so doing, that man demonstrated his allegiance and his patriotism to the cause. That might seem hopelessly idealistic, and soldiers discovered that to some degree it was, and yet, and I want to stress this, and yet, the vast majority of men on both sides retained elements of that all the way to 1865. My friends, this is a critical point, and please listen carefully. The idea that these men were of another time overlooks that one, soldiering, one, is not a universal experience, which we can talk about, but two, that tactics and values or courage, that they went hand in hand. Let me explain. In the Civil War, the weaponry, as we all know, was extraordinarily lethal. And yet, it still allowed soldiers on both sides to line up and shoulder to shoulder, two ranks deep. And when they went on that battlefield, that extreme courage and that extreme bravery, it was not what? It was not purposeless. It was not doomed to have horrific casualties. That those tactics, as much or as you might think as outdated as they seem, the technology of the day, the tactics that they employed came together in such a way that a Civil War soldier could live out those aspirations. But some fell woefully short. And let's go to our next letter here, and we'll be quick about it. The next letter, I should pull it out myself, is from one of my favorite books from a soldier in the Army of the Potomac, Fallen Leaves, by Henry Livermore Abbott, 20th Massachusetts, which was the Harvard Regiment. Abbott has some amazing letters, particularly his letter from Fredericksburg, in which he was engaged in very serious fighting downtown. Abbott will not survive the war. He's killed at the Wilderness. This letter from Abbott was written after Antietam and written about the regimental colonel, Colonel Lee. We got Hartwig right here, man. We've got our Antietam expert. So we'll let him have a crack at this. He's probably seen this just a couple of times. It's truly an amazing letter, and it's one that begins on November 20th. Dear Papa. So if we could skip that page, if you don't mind, and turn it so we can get to the heart of this. The heart of it is on page number 5. You can see in the lower right-hand corner, or page 143. And that first full paragraph beginning, Colonel Lee, strictly private, in that is, again, telling, is it not? Go ahead and read that if you don't mind. And then you'll see a picture of Colonel Lee. And then we are going to turn the page, and I think it just dribbles over just a little bit to page number 7. All right, so we'll give you just a minute or two to read that. All right, y'all. Need a little bit more time here? Just a little bit. Good? Just turn over there. All right. So, again, give us, as I said before, not really doing a diagnosis here. We're just trying to understand, all right, what has happened to Colonel Lee. And you know what? We've got our man, Scott Hartwig, here. Mr. Hartwig, could you give us a very, very efficient, what happened to the 20th Massachusetts at Antietam?
They were part of John Sedgwick's division, which was advanced by Corps Commander in the West Woods. And the division was hit in front and flank by other counterattacks. And in 15 to 20 minutes, they lost 2,200 men. So it was one of the worst slaughters of a large unit in the Civil War. And Lee's not the only person who was undone by this. There were a number of other officers who were, Edward Sumner, who was one of the bravest men in the Army, the Corps commander was easily taken by the whole affair, and numerous officers encountered him later in the day in September 17th reported on how shaken he was. One other point I'll make in here that might influence this as well. When Colonel Dana, or General Dana, the brigade commander, was wounded, Colonel Lee was the senior officer and was to take command of the brigade. And he told Colonel Norman Hall, who commanded the 7th Michigan Brigade, who was a West Pointer, that he couldn't take command of the brigade and Hall had to do it. Hall commanded the brigade through the rest of the battle. Lee takes command of the brigade after the battle was over.
Okay. And just a quick note that Scott doesn't need me as his marketing agent here, but the title of your book, if I recall, is from Rufus Dawes, correct? Could you just dig quickly about, it's obviously about the memory of Antietam.
Give you what Dawes.
Yeah, what did he say? And obviously, this is a title of his book.
Where I got the title of the book from is on June 20th. Dawes, he was with the 6th Wisconsin Infantry.
June 20th, 1863, the Army's coming. Right.
The Gettysburg campaign, they were bivouacked in Maryland, and he got a newspaper when they finished the march, a newspaper boy, and he read the headline and it said, "Another battle at Antietam on Tappas," and he wrote to his girlfriend, "I hope not, I never want to fight there again, I've read the cause of the place." So that became a record.
And John Futch, they marched over the Antietam battlefield coming into Pennsylvania in 1863, and in his, again, sort of fragmented way, he also made the comment how much he hated Maryland and hated being back at Antietam as well, that it had stayed with them. All right, now let's be efficient here with Colonel Lee. What's happened to him? And more importantly, yeah, please go right ahead.
He's paralyzed. You're looking at him being completely distraught, didn't give any orders, didn't do anything, and then he sets out on his horse alone. He's completely paralyzed,
Right.
and then stress takes over approximately 4 weeks later, and it could be either with the dysentery, with the diarrhea, it could have been either due to the stress,
Right, right.
or it could be because
Right.
of the bacteria infection.
Good, excellent. How about Abbott? How does Abbott explain this? Does he see something that we often don't think that soldiers see in terms of the impact, or certainly that the surgeons often did not see? Did Abbott see something that had happened to Lee because of his combat experience? What's he stress here and emphasize? And again, I know you just get it right here in the moment, which is a little unfair, but so be it. Yeah, go ahead.
What said right at the beginning, he says it seems the horrors of Antietam, his previous fatigues, and his drinking completely upset him.
Fantastic. Those three things, he goes more talking about Colonel Lee's drinking, and it is clear that Colonel Lee did have a drinking issue before the war. But what we don't know here, I do, because I've read a little background about this, is that that Colonel Lee was captured at the Battle of Ball's Bluff in 1861. He was paraded through the town of Leesburg. He was then put in a cell. I think it was in Hanover County, Virginia, or maybe close to Richmond. Nonetheless, the conditions were fairly harsh. He is obviously an older man. The physical hardship of all that certainly had taken its toll. And again, a predisposition maybe to drink, but I want to stress this. This is a critical point. It seems to me that there's always a perception that a man who breaks down, one is seen maybe a little bit cowardly, but more importantly, that there's a breakdown because of an internal defect I can't stress that enough. We would never ever see that today. If a soldier came back from Afghanistan and was hitting the bottle hard, what would you say? Why is he drinking? PTSD, trauma, something happened there, right? Now, during the Civil War, you see a man drinking and you say, what? There you go. That's right. It's a lack of character. There's a breakdown there. The war is revealing, right, that makeup is, for whatever reason, not manly enough. So I think that's the important takeaway from this. I'll give you two other quick points here before I conclude so we can have some more of a discussion. This sense of killing makes the man, again, was reinforced by the military hierarchy and reinforced by these surgeons and believed by the men themselves. As we all know that at Chancellorsville, the 11th Corps was put out of position. 11th Corps, those men, mostly German Americans, that they broke and that they ran. That puzzled a lot of people as to why that had occurred. And many of them did what? They did what they did here at Gettysburg. They blamed the 11th Corps and the Germans in particular. They make up what? About 50% of the 11th Corps? Roughly, almost 50%. Right? That's the nature of being a German. Right? So early in the war, this idea, hey, who can be the brave man who shows character, who is disciplined in battle, who is moral? Well, wait a minute. That can only be possible for a certain kind of man. And on the Union side, it's usually officers, men of privilege, men who are educated. Who's denied that? Well, the Germans are. And in fact, a medical handbook in 1863 listed the tendencies or the behavioral traits of various ethnic groups. They racialized it. And not just for black folks. They did for the Irish. As you can only imagine what they said the Irish were predisposed to do. Drinking, of course, and not fighting so well. For the Germans, it was cowardice. For the Italians, well, they weren't really trustworthy. For African Americans, they noted their great physical endurance, but you can be absolutely certain what they refused to acknowledge, that black men could be what? That they could be good soldiers. And then at the end, there was, I'm so glad that Andrew is here. They did what we call racial profiling. They came up with the characteristics of a man who is a malingerer. Racialized it. And they told officers, beware of swarthy men with dark hair, unshaven. I'm being serious, Andrew. I'm not making this up. And dark eyes. They said they'd squirm around a lot. Watch them. If they're squirming around, you're not squirming, Andrew, so you're not that. That's right. This racialization is fascinating to me, but I want to again to reinforce this idea of what? That violence, that men who could withstand it, that is something deep inside of them that gave them that ability. But then even the bravest soldiers didn't hold up after a while, and people started to wonder, why is this happening? And there was another example in which the medical establishment in the Army of the Potomac was puzzled by a Union officer who had had a brilliant war record, brilliant, courageous, battle after battle. And then, in 1864, not far from Cold Harbor, a shell exploded nearby. He was not hit by any fragments. There was no blood. He was stunned. And then he did what? He disappeared. Found his way on a boat and got himself deserted, got himself back up. And the doctor wrote, this makes basically no sense. How could a man who had established his courage for everyone to see suddenly wreck his reputation by deserting, and he wasn't even wounded? But ideas about what men could withstand started to soften, they became more malleable, and men became more pragmatic. And so I'm going to quickly finish with an example from, because as we all know, when we're at Gettysburg, we're obligated to mention Joshua Chamberlain. And I'm about to do just that, although it's just an oblique reference. It's actually from Amos Judson, who's in the 83rd Pennsylvania. It's not in there, you all. We'll get to something here in just a moment. Amos Judson, his regimental history, which was published in 1866, I believe, right after the war. And what he discovered is that men rarely behaved with any consistency under fire. In one moment, they'd be a dependable fighter, and then an instant later, that same soldier was shaky and hesitant, desperate to disappear from the front. And he wrote, actually it was published in 1865, excuse me, which is again remarkable. I have seen men fight well one day and give evidence of timidity the next. But these fluctuations in his courage are merely temporary. As men came to appreciate, right? Courage did not come from a bottomless well. Some men showed more than others. And for those that had proved themselves in battle, veterans did what? They gave some acknowledgement for those past services, were somewhat lenient in their judgments. Real quick example, a man named John Foster of Pennsylvania. He's wounded on Little Round Top. What's the monument? It's a Zouave monument. You all know it. You know you're Pennsylvania. What regiment is that? Like 140 something? Come on, Hartwig. I know you're an Antietam guy. What's the Zouave monument on Little Round Top? He's in Foster's on the 155th. He gets wounded at Little Round Top. He recovers in town. He's sent back to his regiment before the Overland campaign. He's hobbling about some. He does not want to see any more fighting. He writes his wife just that. He disappears from the front. He lies his way, gets on a train, gets to Washington, D.C. He finds a boarding house with 2 other officers. They board themselves up. And while his regiment is fighting it out in the Overland campaign, Wilderness and Spotsylvania and North Anna, he's reading the newspapers and seeing the long casualty list, right? He's seeing that his boys, his comrades, that they are suffering greatly in the field. He got nervous. He thought that he could somehow escape with his veteran status, but he came to realize he was impersonating an officer, and that would probably get him in a little bit of trouble. And he finally, in a sense, cracked. He'd had enough. He decided to return to the Army, which he did. Came back to the Army of the Potomac after the Overland campaign. He wrote to his wife that he walked into camp. He saw his captain. His captain looked at him and was furious, turned around and walked away. Foster wrote his wife and said, I don't understand why he's so angry. Really? You abandoned your regiment for the last few months. But here's the point. Foster was what? He was never charged. There was a recognition amongst that regiment that this man, a wounded officer from Gettysburg, that he had done his part. So with the Foster example and with the words of Judson, it reminds us this. It reminds us that Civil War soldiers, they were neither victors or victims over battle. Judson reminds us that trying to diagnose whether a man suffered from PTSD or not is really kind of a pointless pursuit. Men showed many faces in battle as well as after battle. And finally, Johnson reminds us that we should show empathy and trying to understand how these soldiers coped with the horrors of battle. When we have empathy, we'll stop our finger wagging at the past for its benighted cruelties. And we should remind ourselves that we, like all people, are also entrapped by the very knowledge that supposedly liberates us. And part of this imprisonment comes from an inescapable past. Are we not the intellectual heirs of a Civil War belief that individualism, willed behavior, courage, that's a sign of character and that it can always trump fear? And that brave soldiers, that they suffered silently. Why is it that we label the behavior of the men right out here in the 11th Corps as cowards, but refuse to hold elements of Pickett and Pettigrew's men, right, accountable for the very same charge? Why is it that we find the charge so alluring? And I should note, why is it that we often forget those massive boulders here at Gettysburg? They're not just platforms for our statues today, but they were hiding places for terrified soldiers. The questions we ask and the stories we tell reflect deeply held values about how we want to see ourselves as Americans at war. Contemplation, not quick answers. That is what is in order. Thank you. We have some time here. Andrew, I would really I want to show you all something real quickly. And this is grim. It's really hard to watch. And we're just going to see a little bit of it. It is French soldiers who had suffered from shell shock. And why I want you to see this is that, and again, someone can disagree with me, I don't believe there was really any Civil War shells of that tonnage. That's not the right word. What am I trying to say here? Shells that were so powerful that the mere concussion of them, that they would leave neurological damage that would then keep a man from having control over his body. Like I said, we're just going to watch a little bit of this. This is rough to see, but why it's important is it reveals to you again the differences over time, to move you away from that notion that the soldier experience was a universal one. All right? So we're just going to watch just a little bit of it. Sorry, that's my sounds of winter cabin. Horrific stuff. And I ask all of you, when we go to the battlefield and we think about the survivors, how often do we think about men like this who had to continue to contend with these deep psychological and emotional wounds that tore at their soul here at Gettysburg?